Based on Gustav's size alone, any expert would have estimated he was close to 100 years old. But how old was he really? Size alone can't answer that. Teeth, however, they can, which is why Faye was so obsessed with seeing Gustav's teeth. When he finally got close enough to see inside Gustav's jaws, the teeth were almost perfect. Crocodiles lose and replace their teeth throughout their lives, and older ones tend to have worn, incomplete sets, which wasn't the case for Gustav. Thanks to the teeth, we know Gustav was born in the 1940s, which means he was at most around 60 years old. For the first 2 or 3 decades of his life until the 70s, nothing unusual happened in the region. But then came 1972. To understand what happened, it's important to know that Burundi has 2 main ethnic groups: the Hutus, who make up the majority of the population, and the Tutsis, who historically held political and military power. In 1972, a Hutu uprising in the south triggered a massive retaliation from the Tutsi-led government. The army began systematically eliminating anyone educated enough to organize future resistance. In a few months, between 100,000 and 200,000 people were killed. Many of the bodies ended up in the rivers, and when you're killing at that scale for logistical reasons and to hide the evidence, rivers become the easiest solution. The Ruzizi's current being high, it carried many of them south, right through Gustav's territory. This is where Faye's theory comes in. According to him, this sudden abundance of free meat enabled Gustav to reach his exceptional size. More specifically, those years of feeding on human remains without having to hunt could have broken something in his brain and disconnected the instinct to kill from the need to eat. But there's a problem with this theory. Unlike mammals, crocodiles never really stop growing, but the pace slows down drastically with age. In the first 10 years, a Nile crocodile goes from 1 foot to about 8 feet. Between 10 and 20, they add maybe 50% more, reaching 11 or 12 feet. Between 20 and 30, growth slows to 15 or 20%. After that, we're talking inches per decade. At that age, late 20s or early 30s, a Nile crocodile is already fully mature. The explosive growth phases are over. Under normal circumstances, a crocodile's growth curve flattens around this time. The bodies may have fed Gustav, but they arrived too late to explain his giganticism. Thousands of crocodiles lived in the Ruzizi during those years, all had access to the same bodies, and yet none of them became like Gustav. Unless Gustav was never a normal crocodile to begin with. The growth rates I mentioned earlier are averages. They describe what happens to most crocodiles, most of the time, but averages hide the extreme cases. In any population, a few individuals grow much faster or much larger than the rest. We don't always know why. Sometimes it's genetics or something in their early environment. These cases are rare, but they happen. When you have millions of Nile crocodiles living across Africa, rare stops being theoretical. Somewhere, at some point, an unusually large and fast-growing individual will be born. It's a statistical certainty. Most of these outliers live and die in rivers where nothing special happens. They grow big, they dominate their territory, and nobody outside the local fishermen ever hears about them. But this particular outlier was born at the southern end of a funnel that would channel decades of human violence directly through his territory. Speaking of violence, in 1988, the massacres of Entega and Marangara killed several thousand people. The political context was different from 1972, but for the rivers, the result was the same. Bodies flowed downstream through the same funnel, passing through the same marshlands, although in smaller numbers than in 1972. This is when the first reports of attacks by a giant crocodile on humans begin appearing in the area. The late 80s are the earliest traces of his modus operandi, where he killed people and dragged their bodies onto the bank, leaving them barely touched. By that time, Gustav was around his mid-40s already, so why did he start behaving like that so late? Through what we know today about crocodiles, there are several theories possible. Theory A, the herpetologist view. Gustav weighs over 2,000 pounds and measures close to 20 feet. Every movement burns significant calories that need to be replaced. We've seen that crocodiles never stop growing, but their energy needs don't scale linearly with size. A crocodile twice as long needs much more than twice the food because moving that mass requires exponentially more effort. For the first 3 decades of his life, Gustav could sustain himself the way any large crocodile does: fish, animals coming to drink, and the occasional competitor. By the late 1980s, he was in his mid-40s and had likely crossed the 18-foot mark. At that threshold, chasing fish starts costing more calories than it provides. His own body becomes a problem. Humans are slow, predictable, and show up at the same places along the water's edge. And remember, crocodiles have long-term memories. From a crocodile that can no longer afford fast pursuits, we are the perfect prey. Why were the bodies found uneaten then? The herpetologists would say that consuming large prey requires the death roll, where the crocodile spins its entire body to tear off chunks of flesh. At over 2,000 pounds, performing a death roll is exhausting. If Gustav isn't starving, processing a body might cost more than he would gain from eating it.